Hello and welcome back to freephotoshop.com and tutorial number 13 in our complete guide to understanding the levels command. In this tutorial we're going to look at what the auto and option buttons do here inside the levels dialog box, but I want to start off by introducing you to this photograph on screen called Needles Sunset, a photograph I took from Needles Overlook in Utah. And even if you didn't know the title I'd given the image, you'd probably know from looking at it that the photograph was taken at around about the time the sun was setting. And just for your information, by the way, the sun in this image is behind me and to the left, and as a result of the low sun, the rocks are looking fairly vivid and leaning towards the oranges and yellows in that respect too. Now what I'm going to do is attempt to modify the brightness levels inside the image. So I'm going to click on the adjustment layer icon down here at the bottom of the layers palette and select levels. Now if you remember back to tutorial number 2 in this series when we looked at the auto levels, auto color and auto contrast commands, you'll remember that for an auto function we came out with some really great results. Now we're going to go one step further and actually bring back some control to those auto functions. In fact, we're going to use something that's referred to sometimes, by me mostly, as the halfway technique, where we're applying a custom version of the auto commands and then fine-tuning it manually. So as an introduction, I'm going to hit the auto button, which you can see changes the image quite dramatically in the background here. Now first of all, what we've actually done is applied the auto levels command, so exactly the same thing as coming up here to the image menu, selecting adjustments and then applying auto levels from up here. The only difference is, instead of applying it as a flat static adjustment as we would have done if we'd applied it from the adjustment submenu, we've actually applied it onto an adjustment layer. So the settings that have been used here by auto levels can be revealed inside the color channels. And this can be a great way to work, by the way, when you first start using levels, or if you're stuck as to what actually might need doing in order to correct things inside one of your own images. One of those scenarios when you know that the image isn't quite right, it isn't quite the way you want it, but you're not exactly sure as to what to do in order to get the results that you believe are possible. But we'll be coming back to this in a couple of moments' time and discussing it a little further. Now as far as the image goes here, in my personal opinion, things aren't looking as good as they were before we hit the auto button. And that's because we've neutralized out the rich orange and yellows that were present in the original image. And that's unfortunately just a function of levels in general really. You're always going to want to take care when you have strong shifts of colour, or even what I'd call colour casts, present in an image. If you're willing to just go with the flow, then you could end up losing lights and colours that make the image reflect the mood you're trying to portray. As here with this photograph, the last thing we want to do is lose these rich orange and yellow colours that are cast onto the rocks by the low sun. Okay, I'm going to hold down the Alt key here on the PC, that's the Option key on the Mac, and then select the Reset button. Now this time I'm going to hit the Options button here, and notice that once again as we enter this Auto Color Correction option box, the image changes slightly in the background. Now basically what we have here is a dialog box for modifying the default auto functions that are available here when using levels. So at the top here, first of all, we get our free auto commands that we can apply from right here inside the options dialog box. Now even though they've been given technical names, I'd say fairly technical names anyway, the descriptions are consistent with what they do and how they work. And if I hover the cursor above the free options, we get an even meatier description as to what they do, and then in brackets the auto function it represents. So the top one here, Enhance Monochromatic Contrast, is actually Auto Contrast. The middle one, Enhance Per Channel Contrast, is actually Auto Levels. And the final one, Find Dark and Light Colors, is of course Auto Color. And by the way, if you want more information on how these actually work, then check out video tutorial number 2 in this freephotoshop.com series on levels for all the information you need to start working with these particular auto functions. So for the moment we're actually applying the auto functions here inside the levels dialog box. But we can go one step further than that by making adjustments to these target colours and clipping percentages down here. And the way this works, in way of a quick refresher, the whole point of levels generally is to make the shadows of the image darker, the highlights of the image lighter, into the realms of black and white respectively, and then to stretch out the brightness levels in between to add more contrast and improve the brightness inside the image. And of course, if we do that on a channel by channel basis, as we've done throughout this series, we start improving colours inside the image as well. So some really powerful functions that are available here inside of levels. Now when we're dealing with the auto commands, whether it be from these options here or the static adjustments inside the adjustment submenu, we're actually mapping the shadows, midtones and highlights to these swatches right here. And by default things work out pretty good, because the shadows swatch is black, the midtones swatch is a neutral grey, and we'll be looking at neutral colours inside the very next tutorial in case you're wondering what they are. And finally the highlight swatch is white. So when we apply an auto command, we're turning our shadows black and our highlights white and stretching out the values in between, courtesy of these options here. Now just in the way of a visual example of what's happening here, I'm going to click the shadow swatch in order to map out the shadows, and I'm going to select a dark green here, and that looks about okay for this particular experiment. I'm going to click OK. Then I'll open up the highlight swatch and change the white into, say, a light and pretty bright yellow here, and then I'll click OK to accept that as well. Now I'm going to tick the Save as Defaults option to save out these colours as the default shadows and highlights, then click OK to accept these changes, and finally click Cancel to exit levels without creating an adjustment layer. Now I'm going to hit Ctrl-Shift-L on the keyboard, that's Command-Shift-L on the Macintosh, to apply auto levels to the image, and we get this special effects type of result because we're now mapping all the darkest colours in the image to green, all the lightest colours like the ones up here in the clouds to yellow, and therefore coming up with a result that looks more like this special effect than a colour correction using levels. Now even though if you're doing something like colour correcting images you're never going to be this extreme, but hopefully you've found it helpful to see just how powerful and ultimately flexible these automatic levels can be when combined with the options dialog box inside levels. Okay, I'm going to hit Ctrl or Command Z to undo that. Then I'm going to add another application of the levels adjustment layer onto our image like so. Now I'll hit Options like we did before and just return these swatches back to the more sensible defaults of black and white respectively for the shadows and highlights. And make sure, by the way, if you're following along with me, it's really important that you do set these back to black and white or something resembling black and white, and also make sure that you get them the right way round. We don't want to see any kind of inversion effects going on here by mapping white to shadows and black to highlights. Okay, now I've reset those. Now let's look at these clipping controls. And once again these work exclusively with the auto commands, whether you apply them from up here or from the adjustment submenu. And we already talked about clipping details from an image in previous videos in this series, and I think we left it by saying that small amounts of clipping wasn't too much of a problem, especially if the clipping occurs inside just one or two of the colour channels. Sometimes it's a necessary evil to get things looking the way you want it. Where the problems begin is where you have large amounts of clipping in all three colour channels, causing what we call blown highlights or blown shadow detail. And once again, sometimes inside things like specular highlights it's perfectly acceptable to blow highlights in this particular example of specular highlights. But when you get things like entire skies turning white, which is actually a fairly common problem actually in digital photography, that's when you need to start worrying. Now what we're doing with these options is actually controlling the amount of clipping that's occurring in order to get the most accurate results from the auto functions. And let me just explain how these work. If we focus on the shadows here for a moment, and if I go ahead and select auto levels here, What you'd expect Photoshop to do here is scour the image looking for the darkest shadow, and then once it's found it inside a particular pixel, it's going to match that shadow to the target colour, which of course is black down here. Okay, so once again you'd expect it to look for the darkest pixel it can find and then map it to black. Well, that's almost what happens. What actually happens is when Photoshop is searching for the darkest pixel, it actually ignores the first 0.1% of pixels it finds. Once that percentage is up, it maps the nearest colour as black, thus clipping, in this case, 0.1% of the pixels inside the image to the target colour here. Now that may sound a little confusing, but if I explain why that's happening, it might help. Many digital cameras and scanners have their own kind of mini levels program running inside the hardware, which tries to pick up black and whites. And if the camera does pick up blacks and whites, even if that's just a tiny bit of digital noise, for example, maybe just one pixel somewhere inside the image, then the auto functions wouldn't work, because even if there wasn't another pixel in the image with a brightness level close to black, say the next pixel after that black pixel had a brightness level of, say, 6 compared to the black pixel which had a brightness level of 0, then the auto command would detect the black pixel and assume the black point inside the image is set correctly. If you have your clipping set to 0.1, for example, it would ignore the one black pixel it found and then turn the pixels with a brightness level of, say, 6 to black, along with anything darker than those pixels. So in that example, and using a small clipping percentage, we've mapped that brightness level of 6 to black, and the image is going to look a lot better for it. Certainly a lot better than what it would have looked if we'd have been mapping the first darkest pixel we found to black, because, you know, if that pixel was black, it wouldn't have made any difference to the image at all. At least this way, we know that we're taking more of an average approach to mapping the shadows to black. Okay, so these values of 0.1% that are already in here are the default values, and they seem to work pretty well for most of the images that you encounter. You may find as digital cameras and scanners become more precise with their colour detection over the years that you can slightly drop these amounts, but generally there's no need to make any changes unless you really feel like a change is required depending on the image that you're using. In saying that though, I'm going to go ahead and drop both of these values to 0.07%, thus discarding less of the shadow and highlight detail in the image. Then I'll make sure we're using the auto color algorithm with snapping of neutral midtones switched off. Then just check that save as defaults is turned off, because we don't want to save the clipping percentages as defaults, and then click OK. Now what we've done here is applied the auto color command inside our adjustment layer, so not only is the effect live, but we can also tweak these settings to get the best results. So with that in mind, I'll hit Control or Command 2 to switch to the green channel, and I'm going to hold the Alt key down, that's the Option key on the Mac of course, and then just bring this white point in a bit until we start clipping colours. Not too many colours, but just some of these colours inside the green channel. And I'd say a value of 232 brightness levels is good. Next I'll hit Control or Command 3 to enter the blue channel, and I'll do the same with the white point slider here. So we'll move that to a value of, say, 222 brightness levels. Okay, that looks good as well. Always check, by the way, that the image looks the way you want it after using that Alt or Option dragging trick. Next I want to take a bit of this blue out of the midtones, and I'm going to do that by dropping this gamma value to, say, 0.95, I'd say looks good here. And then I want to bring the orangey colour back that we had right at the beginning before we made any modifications, and I'll do that by switching to the red channel first of all, then upping the gamma value here to 1.1. Next I'll switch to the green channel, and here I'll just notch up the gamma value to a value of, say, 1.03. So we've added about 1 part green and 3 parts red, and that inside the RGB colour mode will help us out a little with the orangey feel, or the orangey colours that we need to get back out inside this image, especially in these sunlit rocks over here. Finally, I'm going to hit the OK button now to accept these changes and take a look at our finished work. And then very briefly here I'm going to Alt or Option click on the original layer to see how things looked before we made any modifications. A little too red in the rocks if you ask me, and a little dull in the sky considering we're seeing the effects of a setting sun. Now I'll Alt or Option click once again to see the image with our changes applied to it. And once again, here's the original, just in case you missed it the first time, and here's our version of the image. Okay, things are looking fairly good. We've checked out the auto and option controls here inside levels, and we've just about made this image look great. And I say that because sometimes when you're working inside levels, stretching out the shadows and highlights and adapting the midtones to suit, you'll find that you sometimes lose a little saturation from the image. In this particular example, we haven't had that exact problem. Instead, because we've improved the contrast, the lack of saturation inside the image is probably more evident than it ever has been. So we're going to go ahead and add some of our own, and we'll be doing that as well as looking at neutral colours here inside of Photoshop inside the next video tutorial. For now, here at freephotoshop.com, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.